I'm Mara Collins, and my best friend, Jonah Reyes, dared me to spend a night in the old Hawthorne house. We thought it would be a joker thrill, but as soon as we stepped inside, the air turned cold, and the shadows began moving on their own. By midnight, Jonah wasn't laughing anymore, and I realized the house didn't just have secrets, it had us. I moved into the house on the outskirts of town, thinking it would be a quiet escape, a place where I could finally breathe and forget the chaos of the city. From the moment I saw it, I knew it was different. The paint was faded, chipped in long streaks, and the shutters hung crooked on their hinges, rattling gently whenever the wind blew. The garden was a tangled mess of weeds and thorny bushes, crawling across the cracked stone pathway like they were trying to reclaim the place. Most people would have turned away, but I was drawn to it. There was something lonely about the house that called to me, something that made me feel like it understood the emptiness I carried inside me. The first day I unpacked, the silence in the house felt heavy, almost tangible. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old wood made me jump, though I tried to convince myself it was normal. I carried boxes through hallways that smelled of dust and something else I couldn't identify. A faint sour smell that made the back of my throat tighten. I tried to brush it off, but a part of me was already uneasy. Still, I set my bags down, unpacked a few essentials, and decided to rest before nightfall. Night came sooner than I expected. The house seemed to sigh as darkness filled the corners and the wind rattled the shutters harder, as though it had learned to mimic a warning. I lay in bed, listening to the soft hum of the house, the distant drip of water, the occasional groan of the ceiling above, the rustling of what I assumed were mice in the walls. Then it started, a faint tapping sound. At first I thought it was one of the branches hitting the window, or perhaps the pipes, but the tapping was deliberate, uneven, almost like someone was counting each tap carefully. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2. My heart began to pound and I tried to tell myself I was imagining it. I held my breath, straining to hear through the silence, but the sound kept coming, louder, closer. It wasn't coming from the window or the walls, it was coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I wanted to get up, to run and see if anyone was there, but my body felt frozen. It was a strange kind of paralysis, the kind that grips you when fear has made your muscles forget their purpose. The tapping stopped abruptly, and I exhaled shakily, convincing myself it had been nothing. The night was quiet again, almost unbearably so. I closed my eyes, trying to will sleep into me, but it didn't come easily. Every shadow in the room seemed to stretch a little too far, curl in a way it shouldn't. I kept imagining shapes moving just outside my vision. I shook my head, trying to force the thoughts away. The rational part of me argued, it's a house. Old houses make noises. Your mind is playing tricks. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I couldn't tell, and I finally drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. Then it happened. I woke to the sound of breathing. Soft at first, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. It wasn't mine. It was close, right beside the bed. My eyes shot open. The room was dark, the weak moonlight spilling in through the curtains. Nothing was there. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I tried to convince myself it was a dream, but the cold weight against my shoulder told me otherwise. Then I noticed the shadows in the corners of the room. At first, they were ordinary elongated shapes cast by the furniture in the moonlight. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to shift, to twist. I held my breath, staring at the far corner, and my stomach turned. The shadows moved like liquid, stretching and curling, forming shapes that shouldn't exist. One of them seemed taller than it should be, with a twisted, hunched back. For a heartbeat, I could have sworn it looked like it had a face, staring directly at me, its eyes hollow and dark. I blinked, and the shadow recoiled, dissolving back into the corner. My body shook uncontrollably as I pressed myself against the wall, wishing desperately for dawn, for the sunlight to burn away the unease, but sleep wouldn't come again that night. I stayed in bed, eyes wide, listening to the occasional creak of the house, the wind brushing against the windows, and the sense of something watching, always watching. And in the quietest moment, I heard it, a soft, deliberate tapping coming from under the bed. The second night, I told myself I would ignore the noises, ignore the shadows, and convince myself that moving into an old house meant dealing with old house sounds. But the moment darkness fell, the house felt heavier, almost suffocating. The air seemed thick, carrying a faint metallic scent I hadn't noticed before. I paced the floorboards, trying to calm my racing heart, but every step echoed like a warning. Something was wrong. I could feel it in the way the walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in rhythm with my own heartbeat. The tapping returned, this time from the hallway just beyond my bedroom door. It was slower, more deliberate, as though whatever was making it had learned patience. I wanted to leave, to run into the hall and confront it, but every instinct told me to stay put. I huddled under the covers, staring at the door, imagining the shapes of hands pressed against it from the other side. The sound grew louder, sharper, until I could almost feel it vibrating through the floor beneath me. Then it stopped, leaving only silence and the distant, almost mocking, rustle of the curtains. Unable to endure it any longer, I finally decided to explore the attic. The stairs were narrow, steep, and coated in a fine layer of dust. Each step groaned beneath my weight, protesting my intrusion. The attic smelled of damp wood, old fabric, and something sour I couldn't identify. I shined my flashlight across the room, illuminating piles of forgotten furniture, cardboard boxes, and stacks of old newspapers. Shadows stretched unnaturally in the corners, and I realized I felt the same pressure I had downstairs, as though invisible eyes were following my every move. At the far end of the attic, I spotted a mirror leaning against the wall. It was large, the glass cracked across the middle, and the frame was warped and rotting. My reflection shimmered in the weak light, distorted by the crack. But behind me, in the reflection, something shifted. A figure stood there. It was blurry, its outline dark and undefined, but its presence was undeniable. My stomach dropped. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand, but the attic was empty. When I dared to look back at the mirror, the figure had vanished. My pulse hammered in my ears as I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a combination of exhaustion and imagination. I stayed in the attic only long enough to snap a few pictures on my phone, hoping that light or technology might expose a logical explanation. But when I checked the screen, I saw nothing, no figure, no shadow, no anomaly. It was as if the thing only existed in the reflection, in a world just out of reach. Unease coiled tighter in my chest as I descended the creaking stairs, each step carrying the weight of something unseen. Back in my room, I tried to distract myself, but the pressure in the air was heavier than before, oppressive in a way I couldn't describe. My eyes darted to the corners of the room, and that's when I saw movement. A tall, thin figure had appeared at the far end of the hallway. Its shape was indistinct, but it was unmistakably humanoid. It didn't move toward me, didn't step forward, yet the presence alone made my blood run cold. And then it turned its head, slowly, deliberately. Its eyes were black, completely black, empty, reflecting nothing. I froze, paralyzed, my mind screaming for escape while my body refused to act. I wanted to close my eyes, to pretend it wasn't real, but I couldn't look away. The figure remained, unmoving, watching, waiting. My pulse raced as I realized I wasn't safe anywhere in this house. Every shadow, every flicker of darkness could be hiding something. And then, just as abruptly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. But the memory of its eyes stayed. They burned into my mind, a void so complete, it seemed to swallow everything else around it. I lay on the bed, trembling, staring at the ceiling, but sleep didn't come. The house was alive with quiet sounds, the creaking of wood, the soft rustle of curtains, the faintest whispers that I could never understand. And then, as I felt myself slowly slipping into a fragile, exhausted sleep, I noticed it, a shadow stretching along the hallway, moving toward my bedroom. Not natural, not cast by anything in the room. It shifted like liquid, reaching, searching. And at the very tip of it, a small black hand emerged, curling as though it were ready to grab me. By the third night, fear had become my constant companion. I stopped trying to rationalize the noises, the shadows, the whispers. They weren't figments of imagination anymore, they were real, tangible, and growing bolder. The house no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like a trap. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the walls, made me flinch. Even the familiar shapes of furniture seemed threatening now, twisting into impossible forms whenever I glanced at them. The air itself felt heavier, pressing against my chest with every breath. The tapping had returned, louder and sharper than before, echoing through the hallway outside my room. This time it wasn't slow and deliberate, it was erratic, urgent, almost angry. I stayed in bed, frozen, listening as it moved closer, circling the walls like an invisible predator. I tried to block it out, told myself to breathe, to stay calm, but my heart refused to listen. Then, as abruptly as it had started, the tapping stopped, leaving only a soft whispering sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. Unable to ignore it any longer, I forced myself out of bed and moved toward the living room. The house felt different in the darkness, more spacious, more alive. Shadows twisted across the walls, creeping along the floor like thick smoke. I kept thinking I could see shapes moving in the corners of my vision, but whenever I turned, there was nothing there. Yet the feeling of being followed never left me. My footsteps were drowned by the creaking of the floorboards, and still, I felt the presence behind me, breathing down my neck, waiting. In the living room, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. Black handprints had appeared on the walls, trailing from the floor upward as though something or someone had climbed with terrible deliberation. I hadn't seen them before. The prints were small, thin, and unnervingly human, yet they looked wrong, distorted, almost like they belonged to someone not quite alive. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run, but the front door wouldn't budge. It was as if the house had grown roots overnight, trapping me inside. Panic rose in my chest as I realized there was no escape. I bolted up the stairs toward my bedroom, but the whispers followed me. They weren't words I could understand, just a soft, urgent murmur, repeating, echoing, pressing into my mind. I reached my room, slammed the door, and leaned against it, trembling. The room was quiet now, almost too quiet, and I thought for a moment I had shaken it off. Then I felt it, a brush of cold against my foot, gentle, deliberate, like someone had just stepped out of the shadows. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The shadows in the corners of the room had begun to stretch unnaturally, growing longer, denser. Faces appeared in the darkness, grotesque and screaming, eyes wide, mouths open in silent terror. I could feel their gaze piercing me, probing my thoughts. And I realized with horror that they weren't just shadows, they were watching, learning, feeding. Something moved behind me, swift and silent. I dared not turn my head. My body shook as I crawled backward along the floor, trying to distance myself from whatever had entered the room. The whispering grew louder, closer, like it was right in my ear now. I could feel it brushing against my hair, caressing my neck. I knew if I turned, I would see it, but the pull of curiosity and terror was stronger than my will. When I finally dared a glance, I realized with a jolt of icy fear that the shadow had taken form. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its head swiveled unnaturally, as though it were observing me from every angle at once. Its eyes were black voids, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. And then I saw the thing I can never forget, the hands. They reached toward me from the shadow, long, skeletal, curling with a slow hunger. My heart froze, my limbs refused to move, and I understood that I was no longer alone in this room, that the boundaries between me and the darkness had vanished. I tried to scramble to the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The whispering turned into a low, guttural chant, vibrating through my skull. The shadows writhed around me, climbing the walls, pooling on the floor, forming shapes I could not comprehend. My mind screamed in panic, but the terror was paralyzing. And then I felt it brush against my ankle, a cold, solid pressure that gripped me, anchored me to the spot. I looked down, and my blood ran cold. A black handprint had appeared on the carpet, as though something had stepped out of the shadows and left a mark in the very fabric of reality. And in the center of the print, I saw the tiniest detail that made me want to scream, the faint outline of a finger, pointing directly at me. By the fourth night, I had stopped pretending I could handle this house. The fear had become a constant, a weight pressing down on me with every step I took. Sleep had become impossible. My eyes refused to close for more than a few minutes before I woke to the house breathing around me. Shadows were no longer confined to corners. They slithered along the walls, stretching toward me, pooling on the floor. Reaching, always reaching. I could hear whispers now, louder, more insistent, as if the house itself was speaking through the air, through the floor, through the walls. I barricaded myself in my bedroom, stacking furniture against the door, hoping the presence outside couldn't get in. But it didn't matter. The house had learned me. It knew my movements, anticipated my panic, and twisted reality around me. The whispers followed me everywhere, insistent, unintelligible, like the chanting of something ancient and patient. I could feel the air shift, colder than it had ever been, heavier than it should be. My skin crawled, and the hair on my arms stood on end. I began noticing a pattern. The shadows always avoided one spot in the room, the corner near my bed, where an old wardrobe stood. For some reason, the darkness recoiled from it, and I realized, with a strange mix of fear and curiosity, that whatever I did, the shadows never touched the wardrobe. Trembling, I approached it. The wood was old, splintered, and covered in dust. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking, and slowly opened the doors. Inside, I found nothing at first, just the rotting remains of clothes, piles of yellowed fabric that smelled of mildew. But tucked at the very back was a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked, brittle with age, and the pages inside were filled with neat handwriting, faded but legible. I flipped through it, my fingers trembling. It was the diary of someone who had lived in this house long ago. At first, the entries were mundane, describing daily life, small frustrations, ordinary worries. But as I read on, the tone changed. The words became frantic, filled with terror. The writer described the same tapping, the same shadows, the same black-eyed figures I had seen. The last entries made my stomach twist in fear. They wait for you, they watch, and when they find you, they won't let you leave. They are hungry for more than your fear, they are hungry for your soul. Do not open the wardrobe, do not look in the mirror. They are patient, but they always come. I stumbled backward, heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers grew louder, turning into guttural chants, almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. The shadows in the room began to move again, writhing, stretching, pooling around the edges. I could see faces forming in the darkness, twisted and screaming silently. The air was thick with their presence, and the pressure against my chest made it hard to breathe. Suddenly a loud crash sounded behind me. The wardrobe door slammed shut on its own. I jumped, heart racing, my whole body trembling. The room went dark, the flashlight I'd been holding flickering and dying in my hand. The shadows seemed to pulse, to grow closer, and I realized that they were no longer bound to corners or walls. They were everywhere, surrounding me. And then I saw it. One of the shadows separated itself from the others, forming a tall, thin figure that loomed over the room. Its head twisted unnaturally, as though it were observing me from multiple angles at once. Its black eyes reflected nothing, absorbing the dim light that remained. I tried to run, but my legs refused to obey. The whispers turned into screaming, filling my mind, echoing, vibrating through my skull. I could feel something moving at the edge of my vision, brushing against my arm, my leg, my neck. The air was cold, suffocating, heavy with the weight of countless presences I couldn't see. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw a small hand emerging from the wardrobe door, black and twisted, reaching toward me. My stomach dropped, and a scream rose in my throat, but no sound came out. The hand paused, fingers curling, pointing at me. I realized then that whatever was in this house didn't just want to scare me, it was claiming me. The whispers grew louder, closer, chanting my name. The shadows writhed around me, forming shapes I could not comprehend. I felt the cold brush of fingers on my skin, over and over, like an endless repetition of touch. And then I noticed a faint outline of a figure behind me in the mirror, though the mirror should have been reflecting only my own terrified face. Its black eyes stared into mine, unblinking, smiling. I fell to the floor, trembling, paralyzed by the realization that the house had never been empty, that the shadows had been waiting for me from the very beginning. And in the corner near the wardrobe, where the shadows had always recoiled, a single black handprint appeared, pressing itself into the floor, as if marking me, claiming me. The fifth night, I realized there was no avoiding it. No barricade, no hiding, no denial could protect me anymore. The house had claimed me in ways I didn't fully understand. I had to leave, or at least try. I grabbed my flashlight, heart hammering, and made my way to the front door. Each step felt heavier, as if the house itself were pressing down on me, slowing me, dragging me back. The whispers followed me, louder than ever, chanting in a rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat. The shadows writhed around me, stretching, twisting, reaching toward me with long, impossibly thin fingers. I yanked at the doorknob, and it budged. Relief surged through me as I stumbled outside, the night air cold and sharp against my skin. I ran across the overgrown garden, the weeds tearing at my legs, but I didn't care. I needed distance, I needed safety. I glanced back once, and the house looked ordinary in the moonlight. Still, quiet, but for a heartbeat I thought I saw movement at a window. A black figure, tall and thin, standing, watching. Its eyes, completely black, reflected nothing, yet I felt them piercing through me, following me even from inside. I didn't stop running until I reached my car parked at the edge of the property. Hands shaking, I fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness as I sped down the narrow road, leaving the house behind. My chest heaved, my eyes burned from fear and exhaustion, but at least I was free, or so I thought. When I got home, I tried to settle in, trying to convince myself that leaving the house had ended everything. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows, convinced the house could not reach me here. But the moment I entered my bedroom, I knew the truth. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though the darkness had followed me. Shadows lingered in corners where there should have been none. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was paranoia. That night, sleep did not come. I lay in bed, eyes wide, listening to the silence, too afraid to move, and then I heard it, the faintest tapping, soft and deliberate, echoing somewhere inside my room. It wasn't outside, it wasn't in the walls, it was here, close, deliberate. I froze, my stomach sinking as I realized I was no longer in a normal space. The room itself had changed, become alive with its own rules, its own horrors. The shadows began to stretch, reaching across the walls like liquid. Shapes formed in them, twisting and writhing into grotesque figures that I couldn't name. I thought I could see faces, countless faces, screaming silently, their eyes black voids. One of the shapes stepped forward, tall and impossibly thin, the black eyes reflecting only darkness. I tried to flee, to get out of the bed, but my body refused. It was like my limbs had turned to lead. I turned my head slowly and my blood ran cold. In the corner of my room, by the mirror, a figure was standing, not behind the mirror, inside it. The reflection was wrong, impossible. The figure mimicked me perfectly, yet its eyes were empty, black, unblinking. It smiled, and I realized with horror that the hand pointing at me from the shadow wasn't T-gone. It had followed me, pressed into the very space around me, marking me wherever I went. I scrambled to the mirror, heart hammering, desperate to see if it was real. The reflection moved independently, grinning wider, its head tilting unnaturally. I tried to shout, tried to move, but the darkness around me had solidified, forming shapes that wrapped around my legs, climbed the walls, and reached into my chest. My lungs burned as the whispers became deafening, chanting my name, twisting my thoughts, stealing my courage, and then I saw it. My own eyes staring back from the figure in the mirror. It wasn't just a reflection, it was me. My face, my body, but hollow, empty, and smiling in a way I never could. My hands reached toward me from the shadows, curling around the edges of reality. I understood in a dreadful instant that the house had never been just a place. It was a doorway, a trap, and whatever had lived there had followed me home. The last thing I remember before losing all sense of time and space was feeling the cold, empty hands close around my chest. My vision blurred as the shadows pulled me toward the mirror, toward the reflection that was me but not me. And in that moment I realized the truth. Leaving the house had never meant escape. The darkness had followed me, claiming me slowly, patiently, and now there was no place left where it couldn't reach. I wake sometimes, or at least I think I do. The tapping still comes, the whispers never end, and when I look in the mirror I sometimes see the other me smiling back, waiting, patient, as if it's only a matter of time before it steps out and I am gone completely. The house never really lets go.